Here at Dukascopy TV, we strive to bring you hard-hitting interviews on the finance market's hottest topics. Joining us each week is Dr. Frank Hollenbeck, who certainly doesn't hold back when it comes to sharing his opinion with us. Today, we're discussing the forgotten depression which took place in the US in 1920 and looking at how we can apply that to the current European debt crisis. Welcome into the studio.
Thank you.
Now, this has come off the back of comments made by James Grant, who is the editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and is also being tipped by Republican presidential candidates as the replacement for the current Federal Reserve's chairman. Now, his comments were that the US has been over-medicated by public policy and should consider the government's 1920s response to the recession. Now, if we take a look back, like I said, it is known as the forgotten depression. Why is that? Tell us a little bit more about it.
He's absolutely right, is that what we did in 1920s is exactly opposite of what we did in 2008. And there's an old cliche is that if you don't learn from the past, you're bound to repeat it. Let me take you back a little bit. Essentially between 1914 and 1920, we had bank deposits doubled in size. So we had a relatively easy monetary policy throughout First World War. We also had a relatively low discount rate. And you have to understand the discount rate is the interest rate where banks borrow from the federal government. It was a lot more important back in the 1920s than it is today. Okay. And what happened is because of inflationary pressures, the Federal Reserve raised the discount rate, very similar to what happened in 2008. And this increase in interest rate created basically a depression in the United States, just as we had a relatively large crash in 2008. Now, the interesting thing about the 1920 depression is it was very severe. Unemployment rate went from 4 to 12%. We had industrial production drop something like 30%. We had a situation where GDP, I think, fell about 17%. Now, the government's reaction was, you have to understand, back at that time period, the U.S. was very much a laissez-faire economy, and the basic government solution to the problem was to reduce the government's role in the economy. So how did they do that? They basically cut government expenditures by 50%. That's a significant amount. They reduced the national debt by 1/3, and they basically cut taxes they cut taxes on all income levels by something well over 35%. So we had a situation where what the government did is it basically said we have to reduce the role of government. Therefore, by reducing the role of government, we're going to be taking that money, giving it to the private sector, and with the necessary adjustments that were needed, okay, the private sector would draw us out of this depression. And to a large degree, that's what happened. The 1920s depression only lasted until the summer of 1921, so it was about a year long. It started in the spring of 1920, and it was basically over in the fall of 1921. And the unemployment rate dropped below 7% in 1922 and was below 3% in 1923. And then we had the Roaring '20s that everyone is familiar with in the United States. The key thing here, though, is that what they did is they basically said, we need a readjustment. We need bad businesses to fail. Okay, we need resources to be released from bad businesses so that those resources can be taken and put into new businesses, new enterprises. And we have to do it in such a situation where we have the private sector basically lead to this new growth. Okay, that was a very important decision that we made in the 1920s.
What difference is there, therefore, then between then and now? What comparisons can we make?
Well, in the 1920s, we had a relatively quick recovery, not in spite of the lack of government intervention, but because we didn't have government intervention. In other words, what happened in the 1920s is we basically took resources away from the public sector and we put it in the private sector. In other words, growth comes from the private sector. It won't come from the public sector. And what we did in the 1920s is that we increased the part of the economic pie that went to the private sector, and because we had the necessary adjustments, in other words, we had a lot of malinvestments. It's a bit like when we have a storm. The storm is terrible, a depression is terrible, but what it does is it clears the stage so that we can have new growth occur. Well, the same thing was true in the 1920s, is that we took our lumps, okay, we had a lot of bankruptcies, we had an increase in unemployment, but we basically restructured the economy so that we could then move forward where we produce goods and services that were closer to what people really wanted, okay? That's something that we haven't done in 2008. We basically tried to avoid the clearing out situation, okay? And by not allowing the clearing out situation to occur, we can't have the regrowth occur into the future.
We're talking there about central bank interference, and this has been one of James Grant's main criticisms, is that the Federal Reserves haven't allowed the markets to settle. It seems to be a common theme all over. Central banks are damned if they do intervene, and they're damned if they don't. What is the right thing to do, particularly, in relation to the European debt crisis and to Greece specifically?
Well, one of the things that happened in the 1920s, is, as I said, is that we reduced the public sector and we increased the private sector. In other words, the situation we have in Europe is that we have to have this public sector be smaller and we have to have the private sector be larger. Now, what's happening in the case of Greece is with austerity, it's actually making the public sector larger. For example, the private sector, because of the recession or almost depression in Greece, is that it's lost 450,000 jobs. Okay, the public sector has only shed about 15,000 jobs. So what's happening is that the public sector is actually increasing in size relative to the private sector, as both of them are declining. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing about monetary policy is I said that in a previous interview that every euro that the central bank prints is a tax. Okay, and that's a tax on the private sector. So in other words, if you're taxing the private sector, you're also reducing the private sector. I think there's something that's important that I need to point out is the solution to the problem we have today is twofold. We first have to have sound money. And what I mean by sound money is that people need to be sure that money is a measure of value and it's a store of value. That means where we can't have the central banks setting interest rates. We need the markets to set interest rates. The second thing is that we need to have a situation where the public sector is smaller than the private sector. And that's not what's happening in Europe. At the moment, we're having European governments head toward a recession. By raising taxes, they're actually causing the private sector to shrink faster than the public sector is shrinking. That's not going to lead to growth. That can only lead us to trouble.
You mentioned there before, and you've said it previously, about allowing the markets to set the interest rates and not the banks. But is it not possible that we've gone so far down the line now in this debt crisis that the banks have to intervene? They have to do something?
Well, it's the proverbial kick the can down the road. The question is that do you want to lose an arm today, or do you want to lose both arms and two legs tomorrow? In other words, you have to decide how much pain you're going to have to bear. You're going to have to bear some pain. So the issue is that when you're going to bear it and how much pain you're going to bear. That's what I'm concerned about.
In the forgotten depression, the Federal Reserves refrained from using macroeconomic tools that we now consider to be necessary when dealing with a debt crisis. Could we take the 1920 policies and apply them to now? Would they work? Would they even be viable?
They would work. The difficulty is that there isn't the intellectual, let's say, agreement to be able to implement these type of policies. There's still this very, very strong view that the problem is with demand, and that we need the governments to come in and plug the hole in demand. This is a total different view that we had during the classical economic period, where we really considered demand to be irrelevant, and what was really important was supply. We never really have a problem with demand. It's just a matter of price. You can always sell something if you sell it to the right price. But as long as we continue to have, macroeconomists teaching Keynesian economics in principle of economic courses like I did for 10 years, like I wrongly did for 10 years, then we're unlikely to have the intellectual agreement to be able to make the changes that need to be made. I'm afraid that the only way we're going to be able to make the changes that need to be made is we need to have a crisis, and that's a real shame. Is that we're not willing to make the adjustment before the crisis. We have to wait for the crisis before we make the adjustment.
Dr. Frank, thank you very much. Don't go away, as Dukascopy TV continues to bring you top interviews. This week we'll be joined by BCG and Barron's Financial Services. For now though, goodbye.